Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. After 2 weeks to stew on their opening to the season, Norwich City are back in Championship action this weekend. It's another trip on the road, this time to Coventry City, where they'll hope to make it 4 wins from 4 away from home this season. But it looks like it could be quite a tricky one. Coventry have a very good squad, obviously quite a famous manager in Frank Lampard, and they've started the season relatively well. I think some room for improvement, but certainly they're looking quite good so far, and they're in that bracket of teams alongside Norwich that you'd expect to be competing for at least the playoffs, if not even higher this season. So it should be a good acid test of where Norwich are. Of course, a little bit of momentum after the 2-0 win against Blackburn going into the break, which they'll hope to keep up. You know the drill here on Tactics Board. First of all, I'm going to take you through the 11 that I think Liam Manning will choose for the game. Then we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at Frank Lampard's Coventry, how they set up, what they look like, and how the game might pan out tactically as a result. And then I'm going to come on to the 4-4-2. And yes, I understand there's been a lot of talk about formation, but I did find it very interesting that Manning did go to more of that 4-4-2 at Blackburn. Of course, as I've said a lot of times, it is quite fluid and they do go between that and other systems, but it certainly looked more regularly like a back four against Blackburn and obviously worked very well in terms of the result. So I'm going to take a look at why that is, whether it will work going forward and against Coventry particularly, but we'll get to that. First of all, it's the starting 11. So here's the team I think Manning will choose for tomorrow's game. I've gone for Vladan Kovacevic in goal with Kellen Fisher at right back, Ben Krezene at left back, Harry Darling and Jakov Medic in the centre of defence with Ante Sianat on the right, Papa Amadou Diallo on the left wing, Mirko Topic and captain Kenny McLean in midfield, and up front Matthias Kvistgården maybe slightly behind Josh Sargent in that front two. Now we saw that 4-4-2 against Blackburn, and you'll notice that I haven't gone for any changes for this weekend's game. I think there are probably a couple of discussions to be had about the selection, but overall, I think, first of all, there's that old adage of not changing a winning team, and I think when Norwich are trying to build up some momentum, especially on the road with those 2 consecutive games away from Carrow Road, it does make sense to keep the same team. I think there are areas that they can improve on, and we'll come on to those, but generally that sense of momentum, that sense of a team gelling this early on in a season and in obviously Liam Manning's tenure as the club's head coach. I don't know if you really want to upset that when you have the opportunity to retain that same team. Of course, everyone fit apart from Jeffrey Schlupp, who was fit going into the international break, according to Manning in his pre-match press conference. So that shouldn't necessitate any changes. And I just think overall the stability, well, Norwich could do with some more stability really after a sort of up and down season so far. Of course, some of those debates are around players who I think have done relatively well so far this season and will hope to have a starting place. One of them is Jack Stacey. Of course, Kellen Fisher came in because he had that concussion issue, quite a concerning injury when you watched it, but Stacey's back in team training after going through those protocols, and Manning said that he was in contention for selection this weekend, which does make you wonder whether he might choose him, of course, for an away game where, as I'll come on to, Norwich probably will be countering a little bit more, might have to soak up pressure and then spring out of their defensive block very quickly. That might suit Stacey, and you can see that Manning does like what he offers. They gave him a new contract in the summer, and certainly his style of play probably suits Stacey, even if we do need to see a little bit more in terms of end product from the fullback. But I think Kellen Fisher actually had probably his best game of the season so far against Blackburn, looked relatively solid defensively and going forward, gave them a little bit as well. And I think in a kind of back four where it's more of a fullback role than a wing back, if Manning does retain that system, I think Fisher gives you more on the defensive side that maybe isn't as covered when you've got a back three, and Jakov Medic plays a little bit wider and Stacey can be covered from that sense. I think Stacey is good at tracking back, at making tackles, at doing all of that stuff, but just in terms of the defensive instincts and the positioning, I think although Fisher maybe hasn't started the season perfectly in that sense, I think generally his abilities are are more in that direction than Stacey's are. And, you know, for the senses of continuity that I said, I think also it makes sense to keep him in after that Blackburn win. And as I said, probably his best performance of the season so far. The other debate is around Mate Jurasek, who I wrote a piece about earlier in the week in terms of whether now is the time to unleash him. I think it's fair to say, and actually he said it himself when I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, that Ante Cianats hasn't been in the best form to start the season, struggled a little bit in the first few games. And although I spoke to actually a lot of fans who were really pleased with what he offered against Blackburn, I personally wasn't that impressed. I think although he's getting himself into better and better positions, technically he just doesn't, sometimes it doesn't feel like he's really particularly awake, to be honest. It feels like he needs a bit of he needs sharpening up a little bit. He's kind of a little bit casual at times, and you get the sense that maybe he switches off at times. He said that that was something the team needed to work on as a whole, and I wonder if that partly is down to his game as well. So I think there are things for Cianats to work on. That probably does give an opportunity for somebody else to come into that right wing role if and when Manning wants to make the change. And I think Jurasek has actually been really impressive when he's played this season. In pre-season, there were some good signs, even though the fitness still looked a little bit off it, to be honest. Now, Manning says he's building up that physicality and looking better and better in training, improving those running numbers. And I think when you look at his footballing abilities, particularly what he showed in a sort of circa 60-minute appearance against Southampton in the Carabao Cup, he's got those attacking instincts. He wants to make something happen. And he is just the sort of player who I think fans love to watch and who can give you something really exciting. But the reason I've gone with Cianats in there is, again, that kind of continuity. And as I said, there were elements that people were pleased with against Blackburn that maybe Manning will try to tease out a little bit more against Coventry. But I personally wouldn't be averse to seeing Jurasek in that role. I just think Manning and how highly he rates Cianats is less likely to drop him going into this game. But certainly, even though it was a win against Blackburn, there are some areas that that Manning could address in his team selection. So it'll be interesting when that news drops at 2 or just before 2 o'clock tomorrow. On to Coventry then, and anyone who's seen their results so far this season will know that it's been a very exciting, if slightly turbulent start to the season for them. No losses in the Championship so far. They've been scoring loads of goals. Certainly not perfect defensively, but some results that have really stood out. Beat Derby 5-3 earlier on in the season. Smashed QPR 7-1 at the CBS Arena. And I think anyone who's watched Coventry under Frank Lampard will see that he's put an extra onus on that attacking side of the game since replacing Mark Robins. I think Robins was maybe unfairly labelled as a quite defensive manager at times when he was in charge of Coventry. I think, in fact, he was slightly more adaptable and he could do different things with the team. But it's certainly true to say that Lampard has upped that attacking output, made them even more aggressive and offensive under him. And I'd expect that in this game, they'll probably try to control possession, to attack for most of the game, and especially at home to impress their own fans with that kind of style of play against a team who, although obviously, you know, we all know the strengths that Norwich have, the ambitions that they have, I think Coventry will hope to beat and to make a real statement in terms of their own promotion ambitions. Lampard is quite adaptive. He wants his teams to generally do similar sorts of things. He wants them to press high, to counter press, to attack wide particularly. That's a danger that the Norwich fullbacks will have to be wary of, and we'll come on to that. But also to control possession and to be aggressive and to play high up the pitch. But he does that sometimes in different ways. He can play a 4-3-3, 4-2-3-1. Sometimes he goes back 3 and back 5. It'll be interesting to see if he does that against Norwich, because, you know, we've spoken about the 4-4-2. It might be possible that Manning keeps that system after the win at Blackburn. But either way, I think at times they'll still look like a back 3 or a back 5. And especially if they're in that defensive block more of the time, I wonder if Lampard will be tempted to maybe play with a back 3 or back 5 at times to kind of counter Norwich and to match them formationally. But what they've mostly done at home is a 4-3-3, and that's probably what I expect to see. I think that's the formation that allows you to control possession high up the pitch most easily, probably allows you to get the ball out wide. And as I mentioned, that's a real strength of Coventry's: overlapping fullbacks, creative wingers who will get at Norwich and try to do things from out there. And that's probably where their wingers come into it a little bit, because you look at either Cianats or Jurasek on the right-hand side, probably Papa Amadou Diallo on the left-hand side, both of those options will be quite attacking and will be more inclined to go forward, but they'll have to maybe do that slightly less natural side of their game and defend and help out the fullbacks in this game, because Coventry will go for the numerical superiority in those areas. They'll certainly try to be aggressive and get players into those positions. So Norwich will have to hold firm out wide, and you need the wingers to contribute in that sense, really. So so I think that's an important part of the game for Norwich. Probably also they'll have to soak up some pressure just because of how good Coventry are and the way that they want to control the game. But then we've seen the counter-attacking instincts that Norwich have. And although they're lacking maybe that kind of typical number 10 that we've seen in a lot of good Norwich sides in recent years, they do have players like Diallo, like Jurasek if he plays, Matthias Quiscore, and obviously Josh Sargent can help in that pursuit as well, who are really good at counter-attacking, really good physically, give you that pace. And then you've got players like Kenny McLean, Pele Matson, if he plays any part as well, who can play those longer passes and maybe be a little bit more direct. So although I don't think it will be a case of, big man, little man up to, top up front, the top two, it might be a case of going a little bit more direct, probably on the floor and probably in behind, rather than, a big ball up to Josh Sargent's head and he flicks it on for Matthias Quiscore. But I think that's more their strength at the moment, maybe, than trying to create and get balls into tight spaces and try to create chances that way. So, I think it could suit Norwich in a way, but obviously Coventry are a good side. So probably defensively, just in terms of staying switched on for the whole game, knowing where the opposition players are, reacting to those sorts of things, I think that's really important for Norwich. And even though it's been important for most of their away games so far and they've stood up to the test very well, I'd say it's of even more importance in this game. And as I've said a couple of times, I think it's probably their biggest test on the road so far. All this talk of the system then, and although I think Liam Manning has probably been a little bit bewildered by the amount of talk about the formation at times this season, this is Tactics Board, this is what we do. So I'm going to delve into the 4-4-2 a little bit, why it works for Norwich, whether it's going to work for them this weekend if they use it, and whether I think they should use it. I think personally, well, as everyone who watched the Blackburn game could see, it did seem to work quite well for them. It certainly has more of an attacking slant to it than kind of the 3-4-3 that we've seen at times, and there are a few reasons for that. I think one of them is just the pure messaging of it. I think when people see a team and it looks like a 4-4-2 or a 4-2-3-1, they instantly assume that that's more attacking than a kind of 3-4-3, which obviously isn't always the case, but I can understand that feeling. And I think when you get that sense, it does feel like people are more willing to see and to back an attacking team and more excited by that than when they see a sort of 3-4-3 or 5-2-3 or whatever it ends up looking like on a team sheet. So I think there's that element. There's also the element that you take away some of the ambiguity of those roles. I think I've spoken a few times about how, for me personally, those sort of wide number 10 roles might be a little bit confusing for players. I think although Manning wants to get players into the best areas for them, and you could say actually for Quiscore and Seaman particularly being kind of in an advanced role just off their particular sides, does actually suit their abilities. We've seen many times that Seaman is really good at driving inside with the ball and then having shots or creating chances. In that sense, it just feels to me like they're still getting to grips with the idea of those roles, and they're still trying to adapt to things with those roles. And I can understand that because they're not very common roles that you're asking players to play, and I don't think any of them has really played in that role previously. So I think it removes that ambiguity, that confusion maybe that there is for players, and you put them in more straightforward positions that maybe they've been in earlier in their careers. Obviously Quiscore, and we've seen play just behind the striker at Brøndby, which is probably the role he plays with Josh Sargent a little bit, but also he's been the main number 9 himself as well. So when Sargent drops deep, he's perfectly comfortable running in behind and being the main sort of number 9 type in that sense. Seaman, again, I think Manning wants him to play more of a central role and to be in the middle of the pitch near the goal more often, which again is understandable when you consider his strengths. But even though last season there were some teething issues for Seaman, at least he's played that wider position that Johannes Torup wanted from his wingers, and at least he kind of knows what's expected in that sense. I also think it's easier to get him on the ball, particularly there. I think it's, well, put plainly, it's harder to get the ball into players in the middle of the pitch because every team knows you can score goals in the middle of the pitch. It's much harder to score goals out wide, and they condense things in the middle. They often leave more space out wide. So that means it's easier to get the ball to an out-and-out winger than it is to a kind of number 10 in a slightly wider position. So although then Seaman has to do a little bit more work to drive into those number 10 positions, maybe beat a player to get there, and that adds a level of difficulty, I think he's got the technical ability to do that. So ultimately for me, even if you want him in those number 10 positions, sometimes it can be easier to do that by getting the ball out to him out wide in a slightly easier sense than attempting those difficult passes directly into a number 10 position, especially this early on in a project when you don't have those links between players. Obviously, Norwich have signed 12 new ones this summer, and you're still trying to develop that understanding. I think playing those intricate passes through the middle of the pitch can be a little bit more difficult than just getting the ball out wide and asking the players to do kind of the individual work to get inside. So I think it suits players like Seaman, maybe Papamadou Diallo as well, who can get on the ball more easily out wide than in a kind of hybrid wing-back, full-back winger role, which we saw him play earlier on in the season. And certainly there is room for that. I mean, we saw at Bristol City that this formation can work really well for Manning, and I'm sure he'd back himself to eventually coach it into the players. But we know that Norwich are targeting promotion this season. We know that getting results quickly is important to them. And I just think at this stage of things, when they're trying to integrate so many new players, they're trying to get the players used to what Manning wants, it's maybe easier to do that with some slightly more familiar positions in a 4-4-2 than a 3-4-3 that I think included a lot of positions that maybe players won't have played before and will be getting used to. And just finally on this discussion, I wanted to touch on the midfield area, which I think is maybe the weakness of the 4-4-2. And obviously in the 3-4-3, it was a midfield too as well, but you had maybe slightly more help from those number 10s because they were in a slightly more inside role. And I think the negative of that is you can get overpowered in the middle at times. Obviously, Blackburn weren't particularly good at really controlling the game. They didn't have that much possession sort of in the Norwich third, and there weren't many times when they were really under pressure trying to defend deep against Blackburn. But you look at the way Coventry play, particularly in a 4-3-3, which I think is the easiest formation to dominate the midfield with, and that numerical advantage I think could be an issue for Norwich, having those two players in Topic and McLean trying to shuttle across, covering the spaces of three Coventry players who obviously are all technically good in that midfield, I think could be a problem. And as we saw last season with Norwich against sides like Watford, against a midfield two, if you get it right, you can really overwhelm and overrun that midfield too. So Norwich need really good players in there. I think McLean and Topic have both made good starts to the season, so you'd back them individually, but tactically I'd say that's where maybe the 3-4-3 or a different variation of a back three, back five could suit Norwich going forward. But ultimately right now for me, the 4-4-2 just looks a little bit more comfortable for Norwich, and it'll be interesting to see if they use it against Coventry. Of course, we'll have the game covered across our channel, so go to pinkun.com/subscribe if you haven't already and get access to all of that content. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. I'll see you for the next one, hopefully when Norwich have made it 4 wins out of 4 on the road.